This is Popular Front, a podcast focused on the niche details of modern warfare and underreported conflict with me, Jake Hanrahan. Today we're speaking to researcher Aram Shabanian. He's going to be talking to us about the situation over the weekend where the Kremlin paramilitary unit Wagner turned its guns essentially on the Kremlin. They launched a mutiny, took their tanks, took their men, took their anti-aircraft weapons across the border where they'd been fighting in Ukraine and made their way up to Moscow. Russian helicopters and a plane were shot out of the air, MOD buildings were seized, and then suddenly everything stopped and turned around. Strange situation. We're going to be looking into it. If you like what we're doing, support us at patreon.com/popularfront. As we know, over the weekend, Wagner, the paramilitary firm backed heavily by Putin and various dark money resources, turned its guns kinda on the Kremlin. And then decided, nah, actually, we're going back. Very weird situation. Essentially a 24-hour mutiny from Wagner. Maybe before we get into the full details of what actually happened, how it developed, let's go into who Wagner is, because I'm sure there's some people out there that saw this and were like, oh, good, there's a kind of mutiny happening and there's another unit is gonna stop Putin. Well, actually, like, Wagner is just scum of the earth, like the kind of stuff they've been done. Let's go into who they actually are, because I think some people are a little bit confused.
Yeah, so Wagner, they're a mercenary organization, essentially a private army that works at the behest of Vladimir Putin and one of his close allies, Yevgeny Prigozhin. And they've been around since about 2014, 2015. They were smaller. They had about 250, 300 guys back in 2014. And what they are basically is think of them essentially like Blackwater, but not quite the same, in the sense that they're mostly military veterans from the Ministry of Defense. They get Russian Ministry of Defense equipment, and they work at the behest of the Russian state. They work where the Russian state can't be seen with its hands directly involved. And so we saw a lot of Wagner work in Syria, and we see them a lot in Africa, where the Russian state doesn't necessarily have either the international authority or the domestic legal authority to deploy military forces for these various conflicts. So they use Wagner kind of as an auxiliary. And they became more heavily used in the war in Ukraine as the Russian Ministry of Defense itself was bogged down in cities like Bakhmut. They were seen as a way to drive the war without losing Russian conscripts and Russian contract soldiers who, for lack of a better term, or lack of a better way of saying this, had families who cared about them. A lot of these people were taken out of prisons. They were like not good dudes. And so their families were seen as less important, I guess, to the Russian state than the average Russian soldier.
Maybe let's just go into a little bit about how this group actually started, because it wasn't Prigozhin that started this group. It was another guy, the guy with the SS tattoos. The reason it is called Wagner, i.e. it was named after Hitler's favorite composer. You can probably guess the ideology of the guy that actually started Wagner. Right.
His name was Dmitry Utkin, and he was a Ukrainian-born Russian army officer, who was a special forces officer in the GRU. He was a lieutenant colonel in the GRU, and his call sign on the battlefield was Wagner. And I mean, to show you his closeness with Putin, I mean, he's gotten the Order of Courage of Russia 4 times. He's got, like you said, Jake, he's got the SS lightning bolts tattooed on his neck. I mean, for a guy that decries the Ukrainians as Nazis, this dude certainly kind of looks like a Nazi.
Yeah. So this paramilitary unit, PMC, Wagner, backed by the Kremlin, funded by the Kremlin, and they did a lot of bad shit whilst doing that. We have seen a very notorious video from Syria where Wagner fighters are cutting off the limbs of a man that he's alive, cutting off his arms, his legs, I believe, if I remember rightly, with a spade, like a combat spade. these guys have been doing a lot of bad shit, right, all across the world before this stuff happened.
Right, and I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding about them. A lot of people seem to think that they're like an elite special forces unit, and they're not elite. They're just regular guys. I mean, they're elite in the sense that like
they're experienced, though, right?
Right, and in the sense they're elite in the sense that like they could kick my ass, but like not like SEAL Team 6 stuff, right? Like, and so what they're used for a lot in places like Syria, in the Central African Republic, in places like Venezuela even, is auxiliary forces for the local military, but also they're seen as more loyal to whomever the head of state is because they don't have a dog in the fight, right? Like, if I'm not Venezuelan, but I'm protecting the leadership of Venezuela, I'm doing it for money, and my money's coming from Russia. I'm not necessarily under the sway of who wants to be in charge of Venezuela because I don't have a dog in the fight. And so they're seen as useful for that too.
Right. Guns for hire on a very big scale, basically.
Exactly, right.
And they entered the Ukraine war. More specifically, they're known for their battles in Bakhmut. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so basically the Russian Ministry of Defense was bogged down in Bakhmut by the Ukrainians, and it turned into a slugfest. And so Wagner was brought in to basically overwhelm the Ukrainians, and a lot of people were saying they were using human wave tactics and then posting videos of things that were just absolutely not human waves. So, I mean, they weren't doing that, but they were definitely using unsupported infantry assaults or very lightly supported infantry assaults against the Ukrainians, who had very much overwhelming firepower. And to me, as a student of the Iran-Iraq War, it kind of reminded me a bit of that, where we had the Iraqi army with superior firepower and superior weaponry up against a numerically superior foe who was throwing away the lives of their men, basically piecemeal, with the intent of overwhelming and bogging down the more technologically advanced forces. And that's kind of what we saw happening in Bakhmut. And again, as I touched on earlier, the reason Wagner was effective in Bakhmut was because these were men who were from prison or from the military who maybe didn't have anything to go back to or as much to go back to, and they were more working for a paycheck than for an ideological cause. And that makes them easier for the Kremlin to throw away, because it's not some 18-year-old from Moscow or St. Petersburg. It's, some 26-year-old convict who, to you and I, is still a human being.
So a lot of the trouble started in Bakhmut. So this mutiny didn't just happen overnight. Bakhmut is when we started to see Prigozhin, the head commander, basically saying, right, something's weird is going on. The Kremlin aren't helping us out. We're not getting enough this, that, and the other. This is a meat grinder. That's when things started to get weird, right? He was releasing these, at the time, and kind of still now, like comical videos where he's like growling down the camera, and he started off as being like, yeah, we're not getting the support. Soon it was like kind of fuck Putin, and then it was like, right, we're gonna ride on Moscow. How did that all come about?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what we're seeing there is Prigozhin misunderstanding his role in the war. I think that he saw himself as kind of a kingmaker, when the reality is that the Ministry of Defense was never going to like him, and Russian contract soldiers were never going to like him, because soldiers don't like militias. They don't like mercenaries. They like people who follow their set of rules and their order. And so if I've spent the last 10, 20 years working my way up the Russian military to become a commander, and then this Prigozhin jackass shows up with his inmates, his convicts, and takes over the battle, I'm going to be kind of, if not pissed off, less likely to help him and less likely to give him supplies. And if you're having supply issues the way the Russian military has since last year, where they can hardly get enough weaponry and fuel for their own men, you can absolutely see a situation where they would bogard their supplies and not give anything to Wagner, who would then see themselves as being starved out and left to do the hardest fighting without effective weapons. And so I think what both sides are saying about what's happening is true, in that the Russian Ministry of Defense thinks that Wagner are kind of yahoos, and Wagner thinks that the Ministry of Defense doesn't care about them. And I think that there's reasons for that, reasons that those things are taking place.
There was some reports at the time that Wagner, before this mutiny, they started fighting with regular military in the occupied parts of Ukraine, where they even took hostage, or took prisoner, if you like, a commander. I forget exactly who, but he was pretty significant. How did that all happen? What was going on there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that again ties back to frustrations with lack of supply and chain of command issues. Where I think before we saw a general mutiny of Wagner, we saw localized mutinies. Against, for lack of a better term, the more significant local bastards, right? Like, okay, if you're mad at the entire Russian Ministry of Defense, that's one thing, but if you're taking a certain dude hostage, I happen to believe that that dude probably did something in particular to that local group of Wagner fighters that made them pissed off enough to take him hostage, despite what might happen to them in response. And I think that's the other side of this, is that things must be pretty desperate on the battlefield for Wagner and for the Russian Ministry of Defense for people to be willing to take up arms against Vladimir Putin. I mean, that's a death sentence, and everybody knows it.
Yeah, well, let's get to that. So the mutiny started when Prigozhin released this video saying, oh, the Russian, I think he said the special forces or some more advanced unit has hit our positions inside occupied Ukraine with rocket strikes. He said over 25 of his soldiers, of his fighters in Wagner had been killed, and he released this footage where you can hear a lot of shooting in the background. They're running about shouting. However, there is not a single body in that footage, and to this day there has not been one single video or image released of any dead Wagner within that supposed missile strike as far as Monday 26th of June today. So I find that very sus. I think it was perhaps something that he just kind of false flagged to then say, okay, now let's really go and start this mutiny, or maybe something, I don't know, strange was going on. What do you think?
No, I think you're dead on. I think what happened was probably that the Russian military was getting ready to make a move on Prigozhin, and he saw that coming and needed to make his move first. Otherwise, he would have just gone away. And he's still going away now, but kind of under his own power a little bit. Right? He didn't win, but he didn't really lose either. And I think that's what kind of shows that this is not over yet, is that there hasn't been a definitive... He's not dead, and he's also not in power or on the side of the people who are in power. He's kind of in limbo. And so I don't think we're done with this yet. I think that the immediate issue is over, but I think that long-term, this has created fractures in Russian society that will not be fixed soon.
I think that's right. But let's go back to the start of the mutiny. So how did that actually start? After this thing, he declares via telegram that he's going to roll on Moscow, or whatever it was that he said. Take us through that. How did that progress?
Yeah, so he released a series of videos, basically, where he was saying he was going to go march on Moscow, but the first thing they did was they marched on the city of Rostov-on-Don, which is near the Ukrainian border. It's near the Sea of Azov, and it's not a small city. I mean, it's a significant Russian city. They took it over. They took over the local air base. They took over the administrative buildings, and they took over the FSB buildings. And they had tanks. I mean, these weren't just like dudes with rifles like we saw in 2014 in eastern Ukraine, where it was like dudes with assault rifles and stuff. These were like dudes with T-90s and like anti-aircraft guns who shot down not just Russian helicopters, but they shot down an IL-22M, which is like a 4-engine turboprop intelligence aircraft with like 8 to 20 dudes on board.
And that's been confirmed today as well.
That's been confirmed, yeah. Right. And that's a significant asset loss for the Russians, because not only is that a rare aircraft, there's the people on that aircraft are high-level analysts who have spent their entire lives working their way up to being electronic warfare analysts or whatever they were. That was a big loss, and not something that the Russian military will forget very quickly. Even if maybe Putin has an interest in moving past this, I don't think the Russian military will. But that's later on down the road. So the mutiny starts in Rostov, and then we start hearing reports of a convoy heading toward Moscow. And so what was alarming to me wasn't so much the reports of the convoy, because there wasn't any visual corroboration of that early on. The thing that I had visually to corroborate early on was like a convoy of no fewer than 60 municipal dump trucks driving across a live stream in Moscow, like down the highway, never-ending stream of orange dump trucks full of dirt heading somewhere. And then we start seeing him on Telegram blockading roads.
Right, they're going to build berms, right?
Berms and stuff, yeah, like on the highways, like on the Moscow Ring Road, like not small roads. Like imagine if they were blockading the interstates in the U.S., like that's what we're talking about, right? Like not a small deal. They were panicking. The government was panicking.
So they went to Rostov, and they surrounded the Ministry of Defense building, and then there's this video where Prigozhin goes in and he talks, I think, the deputy of the Ministry of Defense, and basically he calls them senile old fools. He says that, you know, he's coming in, he's going to take over, he wants to save Russia. That's when I felt like, okay, this is actually serious, because honestly, until that point, I was like, this is a show, this is smoke and mirrors, something's fishy. It turned out to be quite fishy, but that's when I think it was like, okay, actually something is serious here, right?
Right, and especially because that's when his rhetoric started to shift, and he never explicitly condemned Putin, and he never called for Putin's overthrow. But I can't help but feel like that's where it was heading, because you don't normally march on the Capitol with any intentions other than overthrowing the leadership, right? Like he kept his rhetoric very much in line with, I'm mad at the Ministry of Defense and the old men at the Ministry of Defense. I'm marching on the Capitol to attack the Ministry of Defense. And I think the unspoken, there was an unspoken, I'm coming after you, Putin, that was another level of rhetorical escalation he didn't reach. They reached an off-ramp before he reached that level, right? Before he called for the overthrow of the leadership. But I think he was close. I mean, he was 120 miles. That's how close.
Yeah, and that was, I mean, so when they headed this convoy, which we forgot to mention, Prigozhin said he took about 25,000 Wagner fighters with him. I think we can probably assume that was like anywhere from probably 10 to 15. Like, obviously, he's going to say 25,000. But still, it was a hell of a lot of men, a lot of equipment, Panzer air defense, as you said. Then they ended up, like within 7-hour drive, I think, like, of Moscow?
Yeah, I mean, 120 miles, depending on the road they take, could be 2-3 hours, you know? I mean...
Wow, okay, closer.
Much closer, to the extent that I had, like, 20 different live streams up of all the different ring roads, just waiting to see the convoy, you know, waiting, expecting at any moment, and then they turned around at the last second.
One thing that before we get into why they turned around and all that, one thing that I found interesting, and a lot of people have raised this point, is there's very little footage of, like, active combat between Russian forces and the Wagner forces. Okay, a lot of fighters at the border, for example, with Rostov, refused to fight Wagner, and they put their guns down. There's video of them just, like, letting them pass, and they said, no, we're not going to fight them. I get that, but that didn't happen on a scale big enough, in my opinion, to then suddenly not really see any battles. Now, as you said, they shot down some planes, they shot down a helicopter, and there was some, you know, footage of far away, kind of, you can hear the skirmish, but there wasn't like crazy resistance. There weren't big airstrikes coming in and bombing the convoy. It might sound stupid maybe, but a lot of people are asking why.
I think the honest answer there is that if the Russian military had opened fire on the convoy, that makes it a done deal. Then their only recourse is to try to overthrow the government. But until you actually start fighting them, you haven't started an armed insurrection yet, right? So until they started fighting them, they could tell the Russian military, okay, guys, stand aside, let them come through. If we need to, we'll bomb it. Stand aside, let them through. We're still negotiating. But if you start shooting at them, the negotiation is over or is much harder to start up. And I think, especially with Lukashenko flying to Moscow really early, I think the negotiations started early.
Interesting. Putin went on the TV and he said Prigozhin is a traitor. Generally, if it's getting to that stage, it means, you know, Prigozhin is going to fall out of a window or his tea is going to get poisoned. He's toast, right? But then it didn't happen. Like, what the fuck?
Yet. It didn't happen yet. And I think that's important to remember, is that we're still very early in this. And so if I was Putin, I would perhaps wait a couple days to get rid of him, right? Maybe wait till he lets his guard down a bit. But I mean, right now, part of what's protecting Prigozhin is that he's surrounded by Wagner fighters, and the Russian Ministry of Defense, short of sending in thousands of their own men, can't really get to him. And so that's part of the issue too.
Well, let's talk about this deal that was made. What do we actually know about that? What do we know about the deal that was made to have Prigozhin order his fighters back to turn around, go back to base, and then he eventually kind of basically been exiled to Belarus?
We don't know a lot about it because depending on the source, the terms of the deal change. And depending on the hour, the terms of the deal change. And so initially what they had said was that Prigozhin would go to Belarus. He would have some sort of immunity. Any of his men, and this is important, any Wagner men who joined the uprising would have immunity. But they said nothing explicitly about the Russian Ministry of Defense men who joined with Wagner later in the mutiny. So that's important. They didn't say anything about them. And they also... yeah, I mean, those are the important things, right? Is that he was granted immunity, his men were given immunity, but the Ministry of Defense was not necessarily. And now we're seeing reports that maybe his men aren't immune, that a lot of them are going to be prosecuted, and that the anti-terrorism case against him hasn't been closed. So it remains to be seen. I think there might be a power struggle going on within the Kremlin, maybe not at Putin's level, but at the lower levels where people don't really know what is expected of them or what to do at this point. Just because it's such a confusing situation.
Right, yeah. So all of a sudden, Prigozhin goes on Telegram and is like, right, we're not going to the capital anymore. We're turning around, despite being like 2-3 hours out. Like you said, the initial report said that the deal was, from what I remember, it said Prigozhin, if he agrees to go to Belarus, basically fuck off, all of his charges will be dropped, because obviously a criminal case was brought against him. All of his fighters, their criminal cases will be dropped, but they will then be absorbed into the Russian military, right? And also the mutineers' charges dropped. But like you said about the MOD thing, they didn't say much about that, so they would obviously be considered traitors as well. But how many of the MOD actually joined Wagner? Do we have any idea of how many defections there were? I know there was like Storm Z, which is a so-called penal battalion, basically guys that got let out of prison to go and attack Ukrainians on their sovereign land for no fucking reason. But other than that, I didn't see that much of, defections. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's more internal, but I don't know. What did you see?
Yeah, I mean, I saw small numbers of it, especially in Rostov, but I don't know how much of what we talked about earlier, where they let Prigozhin's men through the checkpoints. I don't know how much of that was right, how much of that was following orders, and how much of that was mutinous. I don't know. Yeah. I think time will tell with that one, but as with any war, and especially with any war related to Russia, the fog of war is quite thick here, and so we probably won't know for some time exactly how that played out, but yeah.
So everything is kind of stopped still. I have seen people saying, right, this was clearly a kind of psyop within a psyop. Some people have said that it was just a game, a kind of show between Prigozhin and Putin. They knew what was happening, so that they, on one hand, Putin would see who the traitors are, basically who jumped ship and was like, right, fuck, I'm out of here. It's not, now's my time. And then also, Prigozhin would get whatever he wanted out of that deal. Not saying that's right, just one of the theories I've seen going around. There's many different things. If anything is true, though, this is definitely fishy. It's very strange. The whole thing is odd. However, like you just said, serious damage was done. A plane was shot down. Helicopters were shot down. You saw Russians in the street cheering on Wagner. I know now a lot of people online, Russians online, are absolutely furious with Prigozhin. But if anything, I think that shows there was some appetite for an overthrow, if people thought that was going to happen.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think one thing that's important to note is that a lot of people have said that perhaps this was like a ruse to allow Prigozhin to reorient himself to like the Belarusian border to attack Kyiv. But I think that the very visible fractures within Russian society wouldn't outweigh, right? The cost wouldn't outweigh the benefits there, I guess, is my point. Like, Putin is very much somebody who is not just predicated on order and structure, but he's terrified of the Russian people. And he doesn't want anything to look like the Russian people are potentially a threat to him or putting his administration at risk. That's something that he's feared for the longest time, is the Russian people, because I think that he realizes that the outside world isn't going to invade Russia. The only people who are likely to overthrow him and physically drag him through the streets are his own people. And so I think that's why he fears them the most, rightfully.
Right, that's a good point. It would be a really odd tactic to fake this whole thing when you literally had to go on the TV and be like, yeah, someone's coming for me and I've got to put some berms out and troops on my own streets, like in Moscow, it doesn't exactly scream like security. But on the other hand, the deal he made with Prigozhin via like Lukashenko in Belarus, it seems very odd to me. Is that something normal or what?
Well, I mean, Lukashenko has seen himself as kind of a mediator within the former Russian, the former Soviet world for some time. I mean, you think back to the first negotiations between Russia and Ukraine after 2014, where they took place in Minsk. Even though you and I could look at it at a time and say Belarus is not a neutral party, they were the most neutral party that was directly interested in seeing a outcome of the war that was somewhat amicable to both sides. By which I mean Ukraine staying within Russia's orbit, but not being a Russian lapdog. Lukashenko, for all outside appearances, does not love Vladimir Putin. He does not love the Russian state. He wants to be somewhat independent of them, but after the protests in 2020, he didn't have much of a choice. That said, the war in Ukraine, he wasn't crazy about that. He wasn't happy about that, and I think that we've seen that evidenced in Belarus's lack of direct involvement in the war. They were used as a springboard to attack from, but the Belarusian army hasn't been involved, and I think that's partially why, is that they want to maintain some independence. And so the idea that they would act as like a mediator in this situation isn't too outlandish. I think Lukashenko saw that if he didn't get on the ball fast, if he didn't get on this quickly and negotiate some kind of a ceasefire, it was going to devolve, and then that was going to end with him ending with, like, Gaddafi. You know, I think that's what Lukashenko is afraid of, is a drain pipe moment.
Yeah. Well, I think that's where he's at, right? It's like, okay, Lukashenko doesn't exactly want to be this lapdog to Putin, even though he is, but he kind of wants his cake and eat it. He wants to have all of this power and act the big man and oppress his people, but he kind of wants to do it on his own merits. Of course, Belarus can't do that. They kind of need Russia. But like we have seen, as you said, the Belarus military hasn't involved, or well, they've been involved, but you know, they're not going on a full scale across the border into Ukraine situation yet. I think that's accurate. I think that's a good point there. What do you think is going to happen now, though? Because you know, like Prigozhin, okay, he's out the country, he's in Belarus, but he doesn't have all of his men with him now. He's in some like hotel in Minsk.
Right. I think in the immediate term for his men, I think those who didn't necessarily take an active role or a leadership role in the uprising will probably see themselves become soldiers in the Russian Ministry of Defense. I think that those who took a more active role, especially like an upper leadership role, will see themselves falling out of buildings or drinking some weird tea or something like we referenced earlier. Prigozhin himself, though, I'm not sure. I mean, it seems obvious that he'll end up very dead, but I don't know how quickly that'll happen and who it is that's going to do it. I mean, the Belarusian KGB has demonstrated in the past that they don't love Wagner very much, to the extent that the Ukrainians, you know, convinced some Wagner members to go to Belarus and then saw them get arrested by the KGB deliberately. And so there is a history of Belarus not loving Wagner very much, and I think it's probably the same reason that we see with the Russian Ministry of Defense, is that Belarus's state is very rigid and ordered, and they don't like cowboys, basically. And that's what Wagner are. They're kind of cowboys. And we saw that, especially when Prigozhin was releasing those videos of himself yelling in the middle of the night in front of piles of dead bodies. I think one of the Russian Minister of Defense members actually said, "Stop yelling. You know, you look like a madman. Like, if you have a complaint, complain to us, but don't make these, like, Snapchat videos where you're mad at your homies. Like, it's weird. You know, it's not professional."
It is super weird. I mean, it's embarrassing. It's like, it's what a child does, you know. And the video where he's in there and he's talking to the MOD, and now, don't get me wrong, Prigozhin is an unspeakable monster of a person. Like, he's the lowest of the low. He's a scumbag. He has been alleged by former fighters of his to have been the guy that ordered children be shot dead in Ukraine. He is a piece of shit. But when you're watching the video where he moves into the MOD and he's talking to these very high up MOD people, telling them Like, yeah, like you fucked up. We're here now. What can you do? You're old. You're senile. You're a dinosaur. There's no way we're gonna let your fighters free. It was like, wow, okay, this actually is a guy that looks like a leader. Now that doesn't mean he's good, but it looked like a completely different person to what we saw in those screaming, shouting videos. Do you think there was some kind of tactic there, or do you think that was anger, and then the next thing was the execution? Or as some people have said, he came off of cocaine.
I mean, I'm not sure if it's cocaine. He's probably got something else, but I mean, I wouldn't put it past him that the videos that we saw at night in front of all the bodies were the real Prigozhin. That was his real rage, but that was also probably oriented for the boys a little bit, for the soldiers, to show them like, I got your back. I hear your complaints. I'm here for you. Don't lump me in with the MOD guys, right? Whereas the Prigozhin that we saw at the MOD was, well, like you said, very much, despite being a giant scumbag, it's kind of like Saddam Hussein's execution, where he was the only one who looked reasonable. Prigozhin was the only one who looked reasonable there, despite being the biggest piece of shit in the room, right? Like, and so, maybe not the biggest, he was on par with the other pieces of shit in the room, but you know what I'm saying. Yeah. And so I think that when he has time to kind of collect himself a little bit, we see that more professional, suave, sophisticated kind of, well, you guys say this, but this is the reality. You guys are a bunch of senile old men. But when he's just seen a bunch of his men blown up because they don't have enough drones or ammunition or whatever, I think that he kind of lets the inner Prigozhin come out, and it's partially for the boys and partially frustration.
How big of a deal do you think this is for Russia now? Obviously, Putin indicated that the invasion of Ukraine would be over quite quickly. He basically thought that it would be over in weeks, maybe even days, that Kiev would be taken. But that's obviously not a reality. The Russian military has done terribly, if you're looking in terms of like war strategy and taking land. They've done really badly, not to mention all the awful brutality that has been carried out on civilians and fighters of a sovereign nation. But with all of that in the background, now they have a paramilitary unit doing a mutiny, entering into the country just weeks after having that strange Nazi Russian but pro-Ukraine unit, the Russian Volunteer Corps, doing the same sort of thing, not on the same scale, but illegally entering in. It looks to me from the outside, obviously from a Western perspective, that things are in serious disarray. Now, this is honestly the first time I've really felt like, yeah, actually, he is losing some serious control within the country. Do you think that that's accurate, or do you think that, again, this is kind of a 4D chess move?
No, I think it's 100% accurate, and I think that what we're seeing right now is kind of the beginning of the end on the Russian side, at least. I think that this war is going to massively destabilize Russia, and I don't know if the Russia that comes out of this war will look the same as the Russia that went into the war. I'm not saying it's going to split up. There's no real drive for that. But I don't think that politically the same Russia will come out of this war. I mean, they've lost, depending on who you ask, between 50 and 70,000 soldiers killed. They lost 15,000 killed in Afghanistan, and that precipitated partially the breakup of the Soviet Union. So even if the 50,000 killed that the U.S. estimates is inflated, and it's only 10% of that, 10% of that is still pretty much what they lost in Afghanistan, right? And look what that did. So the idea that this would destabilize Russia and lead to some major changes is not outlandish. And I think that this might be the beginning of that. This might be the first very visible fracture that we've seen in the Russian system, because in addition to being a militia that Putin relied on, Prigozhin was Putin's friend.
Yeah.
And Putin doesn't have a lot of those.
We should have probably mentioned at the start, but yeah, Prigozhin, he started off as a caterer, right, for Putin.
Right, he's like an evil Papa John. It's like ridiculous. I mean, Papa John's not great himself, but...
Yeah, he started off as the caterer for Putin. How did he end up being so linked to, like, Wagner and paramilitarism?
Yeah, I think the catering link, he's not necessarily like a chef himself, right? He kind of worked in logistics, was kind of the thing. And so that was part. He was available, and he knew how to move things within the Russian system, right? And so, more than like a military mastermind or anything like that, he was available. He was known to Putin, and he could get things done. And so that's why he was the guy who took over Wagner when Utkin was no longer in charge.
What do you think has happened to Utkin? Because he hasn't been seen since, I believe, 2015. From what I understand, he's still kind of a part of Wagner. I mean, he founded it. Yeah, do you have any idea what happened to him? I know he loves to keep a very low profile.
Yeah, he does keep a low profile. I personally don't know. I think the last time I saw him was a parade in like late 2016. It was noted that he was at some parade, but I noticed him kind of taking a backseat around the same time that a lot of the separatists in Donetsk did, around like September 2015, when it was convenient for the Russian state to have things kind of die down in Ukraine. And then a lot of those men appeared in Syria like a month later. So I think that was part of it, was that he was not, he was too much of a bulldog in a way. Like he was too eager to keep fighting, and he wasn't on a tight enough leash. And I think that that's evidenced by the fact that he has SS lightning bolts tattooed on his neck. He's not the kind of guy that Putin sees himself as having much control over, because he's literally a Nazi.
Yeah, and a wild lunatic.
And a wild lunatic, right. Like, not... He's like a really bad dude. I don't know how else to put that. Like,
but Prigozhin ended up being the same fella. It's interesting.
Yeah, it's something to be said about the institution itself, I guess, there.
True. Something I found interesting was people saying at the time, like, oh, the Russian people are so docile, like, this isn't going to work, like, no one's going to care about this. But immediately, within 4 or 5 hours, there were videos of people cheering Wagner in the streets. There were videos of them bringing them water, bringing them food. There's some people bringing them flowers. Do you think this shows that actually there is some, perhaps, more hidden anger with Putin in Russia than is perhaps made out in the Western world? Now, that's not to say that there's a lot of people that really hate the invasion of Ukraine. I'm sure they don't really give a shit about that, but it does seem that there's other issues there. Not to say that all Russians don't care about the invasion of Ukraine. Literally millions are against it, but unfortunately the majority seem to be for it. But yeah, do you think there's like more of something more to that, or do you think it was just kind of people coming out in the street, just having some excitement?
No, I think there's definitely more to it than what we saw, and I think that it's twofold. I think it's partially a genuine frustration from the war and from the fact that they're losing the war, not necessarily that the war started, but that they're not winning, but also a more deep-seated frustration with the way things have been going for the last 10 years or so. But I think that people realize that they can't come out in the streets and say death to Vladimir Putin or down with Vladimir Putin. But if they say down with the Ministry of Defense, that's a good way of venting it still. You still get your feelings out, you still get your anger out, you still basically say fuck the state without saying it to Vladimir Putin, without crossing that red line that gets you in trouble. And we see this in Iran sometimes too, at least until the most recent protests. People wouldn't come out and condemn the Ayatollahs directly, they'd condemn the political leadership of the country, right? Because if you condemn the Ayatollah, that's like a figurehead, and that's crossing a line. Same kind of thing in Russia. I think they know that if they condemn Putin, then Rosgvardia comes out and beats the shit out of him. But if they condemn the Ministry of Defense, they might have some kind of a way to reach across the aisle to these security forces and say, no, man, we're not against you. We're against the people that are getting you killed, right? It's not your mission to fight us. We're here to help you. That kind of thing.
Right, and that was actually quite a big point of Prigozhin's rhetoric once he was inside Russia. He was like, well, they're putting our boys, they're putting Russian lives in a meat grinder. However, it's kind of got lost a little bit in the madness, but what I found really weird was just before he launched this mutiny, he kind of like almost became like pro-Ukraine. Like he was there saying, actually, the Ukrainians were right. They weren't bombing random civilians in the Donbass. They were actually attacking Russian forces and Russian-backed forces that attacked them. And he kind of confirmed, or at least, agreed with the view that people in Ukraine have. That, yeah, like, we didn't want this in the east. They started bombing us, so we had to fight back, which is completely at odds with the Kremlin narrative that, oh yeah, Ukrainians started trying to massacre everybody that speaks Russian in the Donbass. That I found weird. I have no idea why he did that. Do you have any theory?
That I don't have any theory on. I mean, other than trying to get attention, but I mean, there's other ways to do that. Less life-threatening ways to do that, I will say. Yeah. That part, I don't really have comment on that because that kind of came out of left field for me too. Didn't see that one coming.
No, very weird. I do wonder if it has something to do with the recent meetings that Wagner and the Russian Volunteer Corps apparently had. They both came out with like saying they have respect for each other, and I imagine some kind of mutual backpatting went on there. I don't know, maybe. What's going to happen to the Wagner fighters across the world now? We know that Wagner is still in Syria. They're all across Africa doing awful things in all of these places. What do you think is going to happen to them?
So last I heard, the Russian government said those guys are going to keep doing what they're doing. They're going to keep operating as is, no changes. What that will operationally look like, whether or not they come under the command of a Russian general or whether they're allowed to kind of stay under their own corporate command, it remains to be seen. But the state did say that they're going to keep doing their thing in the Central African Republic and elsewhere. So, yeah.
Interesting. Well, we'll see what happens. Is there anything you want to add, Aram?
No, I think we covered most of our bases here, man.
Yeah, definitely. Unlike Prigozhin's, whose base is no longer covered. Whoa.
Got him.
Got him. All right, mate. Where can people follow you on social media and all of that stuff?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter. It's at Shabanian Aram. That's at SHABANIANARAM. And that's probably the easiest way to get at me. DMs are open. Always happy to chat with people. Always happy to talk with Popular Front fans. So anybody want to talk to me about this stuff, I'm open for that. So, yeah.
All right, mate. Thank you very much.
Yeah, man. Talk to you later.
Рашки конец!
That was researcher and long friend of Popular Front, Aram Shabanian, talking about the absolute Wagner madness that happened over the weekend. Very strange situation where the Kremlin's very own paramilitary unit turned on the Kremlin. Strange situation. We'll keep you updated on what happens next. We are going to be doing a bonus episode on the Patreon soon, all about Wagner's operations in Africa also. If you like what we're doing here at Popular Front and you want to see this continue and you want extras, bonus episode, access to the community Discord, the Too Cool for J School series, all of that stuff, bonus video content as well, go to patreon.com/popularfront or popularfront.co/support. Another way to support and look cool while doing it, go to www.popularfront.shop. You can get our merchandise there, t-shirts, badges, all sorts of stuff. Also, we have a Popular Front coffee blend available now. It's called Flight Risk and it's in collaboration with our friends at Grindcore House. If you go to grindcorehouse.com, you'll be able to buy a bag and the limited edition Popular Front Grindcore House mugs. Thank you to our sponsors, Grindcore House, a pair of independent coffee shops in Philadelphia, USA, one in South, one in West. You can find them on socials at Grindcore House. Also, thank you to Oracle Coffee Shop in Portland, Oregon, USA. They're an independent coffee business selling only fair trade products. See them at 3875 Southwest Bond Avenue 97239. Thank you to Propagandopolis, an outlet selling and writing about historical conflict propaganda from around the world. Buy prints at propagandopolis.com. Use a promo code PopularFront10 for 10% off. And thank you to a new sponsor today, Golden Bear Surplus, a limited run military surplus store in California with its heart in the right place. goldenbearsurplus.com. Check them out. It's run by good people and they're selling some cool stuff. Interact with us online. Watch our documentaries at youtube.com/popularfront. Instagram at popular.front. TikTok at popular.front. Twitter at popularfront_. And again, if you want to buy our merch, popularfront.shop. Music in this episode, the intro was by Home and the outro was by Sam Black. Go to samblackpf.com or look him up on Spotify, Sam Black PF. His music is up on there now. Thank you to the high tier Patreons. They are Cameron Radley, Thomas Giuseppe, Jake Fuentes, Viola Forvel, Christian Bustamante, Victor Villa, Daniel Verdin, Margosha, Rohan Irvine, Ryan Barbadillo, VS, Brian R, Justin Katuna, Evan Pank, Bradley Hope, Wizard Actual, Benjamin Topper, Chongus Bongwater, Siddhartha O, Cameron Collins, Matthew Diffley, Claire, Liana, Robert, Sean, Christianovich, NTHG, Ethan Zvik, Kefir, Peter Nybrayton, Gabriel K, Elisa Middlefire, David McManus, Tom Petrie, James Leons, Bradley Davies, No Dogs No Hamsters, Brendan Crave, B, Dallas Dunn, LD50 Seattle the Band, Adam H, B Rambo, Larson 8669, Ivan Julien, Bjorn Kirsten, Diamond Steen, Michael O'Connor, Jack Doherty, Nicholas Butter, JD, Jav, James Cully, Ethan, Fitzmadrid, Ed Coulthard, D. San, Mike Barone, Liam Williams, DZA, Giorgio Arani, The Vegan Straight Edge Global Compile, Amy R, Rubicon, Frank Austin, Amelia Me, Christina Ravetti, Freya Northman, Niba Noah, Andrew Hurley, Vida Provost, Brian McLaughlin, Tom Lochrin, Young Wasabi, Tony Bin, JL, Stephen Davila, Lawrence Abrahams, Peter McCormick from What Bitcoin Did, Christopher Martin, Ryan Sandercock, and Moritz Zumbul. Thank you all so much. Keeping this going, keeping it moving forward. Patreon.com/popularfront.
Конец.